Hello everyone, my name is Patrizia Lombardi. I am professor in planning, evaluation and decision making for sustainable development at Politecnico di Torino, where I coordinate the Green Team established in 2015 for raising awareness inside and outside our community and taking care of the decarbonization of our campus. I'm currently president of the Italian Network of Universities for Sustainable Development. This is a network which has been established for sharing good practice among universities' campuses in Italy and promoting sustainable development in local communities. In this short lecture, I will provide an introduction to the topic of sustainable development and Agenda 2030 with a specific reference to the issue of measurement of progress and the role of indicators and trade-off among different goals of the agenda. Sustainable development is a crucial concept. It is crucial for the world. But what does it mean? I think our starting point has to be how crowded our world is today. We are more than 7.8 billion people. We are up 10 times since the start of the Industrial Revolution. Billions more people are likely to be added to the world population in the 21st century. This is making for a very complicated world, a world divided between great wealth and still huge poverty. A world facing unprecedented environmental challenges. From an ethical and normative perspective, sustainable development is about social and environmental justice, which means providing access to welfare and environmental resources to all human beings, as well as about intergenerational justice, which means allowing future generations to meet their need and enjoy the same level of well-being of present generation. The ethical concept of intergenerational justice has been firstly introduced by the World Commission on Environment and Development, established by the UN General Secretary and led by the former Norwegian Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland. The Commission's report came in 1987 and is published as a book with the title Our Common Future. Popularly, it is usually called the Brundtland Report. The Brundtland Report also reinforced the message of a previous UN conference developed in Rio de Janeiro on the 1992 called Agenda 21 to include all the environmental, economic and social components in the definition of sustainable development and their trade-offs. The past 30 years has brought us much closer to an understanding of this sustainable component. And they have been specified in 17 sustainable development goals inside the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This has been adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015. The United Nations has defined many good agendas for the world, but this is the most comprehensive one, realizing that we should not only, of course, continue the fight against extreme poverty, but we have to combine it with much greater attention to the preservation of the environment and fair distribution of global resources. That is what the 2030 Agenda is about, an urgent call for action by all countries, developed and developing, in a global partnership. I recommend that you go to the UN SDG website and familiarize yourself with the 17 goals. Associated with each goal, you will find relevant facts and several sub-goals or targets. In all, the SDGs are comprised of 169 targets. Having target, of course, gives no meaning unless we have the possibility to measure progress against them. Therefore, indicators have been identified for each target that can be used to assess their global status. Here we see the indicators identified for SDG number 1. In total, 2,030 indicators have been identified for monitoring status of progress against the 17 SDGs. These indicators represent the best methodology we have available today, but many need to be further developed, perhaps even changed to something entirely different in order to effectively measure global progress against the Sustainable Development Goals. And for essentially all targets, we are missing data from many parts of the world. Therefore, there is a need to be a focus on both metric development and data collection in order to accurately assess global progress against the Agenda 2030. In order to simplify implementation of the SDGs, there is a tendency for companies or other organizations to cherry-pick among the 17 and to select those that they consider to be most relevant for their products or activities. Not surprisingly, when cherry-pickings, most organizations select those where their activity make a positive contribution. The problem with that strategy is that it is very difficult to envision activities that don't have both negative and positive effect on the SDGs overall. We cannot achieve a sustainable development trajectory unless we simultaneously reduce negative impact at the same time and we exploit the positive interactions. Numerous studies have been carried out since the adoption of the 2030 Agenda in which the interactions between different SDGs are mapped. One such study was recently carried out by the International Council for Science, and another one has been developed by the Joint Research Center. As you can see, there are a myriad of interactions. Some interactions are negative and other positive. Thus, it's very difficult to support policy decision-making using these tools at the moment. But the research is ongoing for implementing these experimental interactive participative decision support systems. A further challenge in relating sustainable development is that politicians and other social decision makers don't actually think in terms of SDGs. Countries don't, for example, have ministers devoted to the different SDGs. They have ministers devoted to agriculture, health, energy sectors, and so on. Furthermore, legislation is actually made with respect to this different sector or system. Therefore, it's difficult to relate the SDGs to everyday decision-making. The research on indicators and metrics for measuring progress is still ongoing, and it also encompasses a revision of current indicators that are used for measuring economic growth at national level, from current gross domestic product to equitable and sustainable well-being. There is no time to go further in exploring this fascinating subject. And I have the pleasure now to leave the floor to Jeffrey Sachs, which is considered one of the most reliable experts in the field.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Sachs. I'm a university professor at Columbia University and also very honored and lucky to serve as special advisor to United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres on the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. I also lead on behalf of the Secretary General a global network of universities and think tanks called the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. In this module, I want to discuss in more depth the 6 key transformations that constitute the way to get on a path of sustainable development and to achieve, indeed, the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. Each of these transformations is itself a set of investments that spans all of the stakeholder sectors of society, government, business, and civil society. Each of these transformations entails a real change of how our societies operate and what our government policies are as establishing frameworks for society. And in total, these are the transformations that can achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. To make a transformation really means to make specific investments in physical infrastructure, in intellectual know-how through research and development, in skills and health of the population. And those investments, of course, require resources. So the transformations tell us what we need to do, but also we need to determine how we're going to pay for what we need to do. So transformation 1 we call education, inclusion, jobs, and growth. What are the dimensions of this transformation? Well, the first and critical part of this transformation is to ensure that all children have access to quality education, that no child is left behind. And we now understand that schooling needs to begin early, earlier than the traditional primary school level in first grade or even kindergarten. We now understand that early childhood development, ages 3, 4, 5, marks a critical period of neurological development, of brain development, that is, and a critical period in which young children can gain skills of cognitive learning and skills of social behavior as well. So SDG 4 calls for universal access from pre-K through the completion of the secondary level. For high-income countries, that's not a stretch in particular, though the question of quality may be an issue. But for the poor countries, this is a revolution. And I think it's one of the most important transformations that needs to be made. In a typical low-income country in sub-Saharan Africa, today, only around 1/3 of the kids are finishing high school, upper secondary education. This will not work because upper secondary education is vital for gaining at least the rudimentary skills for a digitally based economy of the 21st century. The old jobs that were based on manual labor were hard, they were physically arduous, they were not well paying, but now they're literally vanishing because smart robots, machines, information technologies, smart systems are replacing those jobs in any event. So the first part of the education transformation is get kids in school, keep them in school with a quality education through the secondary level. A second dimension is gender fairness in education and in the labor market. We know that there's a long way to go. In most parts of the world, women are a much smaller part of the remunerated labor market than men. Women work very, very hard, but often in home labor, in production of staple crops on smallholder farms. They tend to the family, they do home production, but they're not earning cash income. And therefore, fairness in the labor market means that girls as well as boys stay in school, that parents don't differentially pay for their children, the boys to stay in school, but the girls being forced to drop out early. We need universally accessible education for boys and girls, and of course a strong social norm, part of SDG 5 for gender equality in access to education, and we need legal rights for women's rights in the workplace. A third key part of the transformation is from schools to work. Now, sometimes it's said, well, a young person finishes school, go find a job. And indeed, in most countries of the world, that's how it works or doesn't work. But the school to work transition is not an easy one. It's not an easy one because often what is learned at school is not the skill base that's needed by companies that are hiring. And often young people lose their way. They end up neither in school nor in employment, but end up with an education, but without a job at the end. The country that perhaps has best bridged the school to work phase is Germany, because Germany for more than 100 years has had a very extensive, very successful apprenticeship program where young people are given vocational education often, but within an enterprise. That enterprise may have no long-term obligation to those young people, but provides jobs partially funded by the government for on-the-job training and skill development. Many, of course, stay on in that company afterwards. Others gain skills that allow them to make a move to a different enterprise. But what Germany has that almost no other country has is very low youth unemployment because of the success of the school to work transition. And fortunately, the German government is interested in sharing that expertise with other countries. A fourth key area of this transformation is to ensure labor standards throughout the economy. The International Labor Organization has a set of basic principles that governments have subscribed to, businesses and trade unions, but often these labor standards are not enforced. But these are rights of workers to not be treated arbitrarily, to organize, to have their voice within the companies, to have fair remuneration, to have safe workplaces. And this is a core part of transformation as well. The SDGs are very clear. No forced labor, no forms of modern slavery, no child labor. We need labor rights in the enterprises. And a fifth and final part of the skills and jobs and education transformation is to help all parts of the world to become more innovative. Right now, innovation measured, for example, by the research and development outlays as shown in this global map, or by the amount of patents that are successfully filed by inventors in different regions of the world, or by the royalty earnings on intellectual property in different parts of the world economy, show an incredible spread between highly innovative parts of the world economy, typically the richest or the fastest growing, and places that have almost no innovation today because they lack a scientific workforce, because they lack the public sector funding for research and development. They lack the tradition or the basis to get started in innovation. Countries that don't innovate can import technologies from other countries, and that's a key part of the development process. But countries that innovate get an extra boost in that they have faster technological change and they earn the returns of the research and development. And so part of the Sustainable Development Goals, especially SDG 9, call for building the institutions, the public financing, the science and technology and engineering and math skill base to enable all parts of the world to become part of this global innovation system. Taken as a whole, this is the first of the transformations: education, skills, inclusion, good jobs, and growth with innovation. In this chapter, I want to consider the second of the 6 transformations, and that is the transformation to health and well-being for all in the population. This is a key part of sustainable development and the Sustainable Development Goals. It's centered in SDG 3, which focuses heavily on reducing disease burdens and promoting well-being. But really, well-being lies at the core of the whole Agenda 2030, its fundamental purpose. I should also make clear that health and well-being are closely related. If you define them, they could even be defined the same way. But we tend to think of health in terms of actual disease burdens, and we think of well-being as an even more general flourishing of an individual within the society. And that flourishing means that there are healthy, good, fruitful social relations and social support systems together with the physical and mental health of the individual. So, as with the transformation of education, skills, and jobs, the transformation to health and well-being for all entails several distinct kinds of investments and challenges in the society. The first of these I would regard as coverage by the health system itself, sometimes called UHC, or Universal Health Coverage, which is one of the core targets of the Sustainable Development Goals. Do people have access to the health system? In many poor countries, the answer is decidedly no. In many parts of the world, there are no doctors, there are no nurses, there are no functioning clinics in rural areas. If a disease like Ebola breaks out, it can be transmitted and spread rapidly simply because of the absence of health sector personnel. Even when there are clinics, doctors, and nurses, all too often households are required to pay for those services and pay amounts out of pocket beyond what they can afford. So universal health coverage is both about the physical presence of health systems and health services, but also about the affordability of those health services. The gold standard of universal health coverage is a publicly financed health system that is reachable by all, so that it's a system even with no out-of-pocket payments or very small out-of-pocket payments, and therefore affordable by the entire population. A second dimension, if UHC is established by having clinics and hospitals and adequate numbers of nurses and doctors and health sector managers available for all and financed through the public sector, is having an integrated health system, one that reaches from the household itself all the way to, if necessary, a tertiary hospital or referral hospital. And an integrated health system means that individuals are somehow connected to the formal health system. It's not a remote, inaccessible, strange and dangerous place to be, but part of the daily lives of individuals. And one of the ways that this is most effectively brought about is through outreach from formal facilities right into communities and into households. And one of the most effective kinds of outreach that I've seen with my own eyes as enormously effective is community health workers. People from the community, not doctors and nurses with many years of training, but people from the community with a few months training perhaps, and provisioned with some diagnostics, some medicines that they carry with them in a bag, in a backpack, and perhaps a smartphone which helps to guide them and helps, of course, for them to connect with emergency services of all kinds. So an integrated health system has health informatics, collecting data, electronic medical records, community health workers with outreach into the communities, also putting in data from their visits to the households. And increasingly, because of our sophisticated digital revolution, households will connect remotely to monitors, sensors, especially when they're under treatment or under therapy, to measure blood pressure or heart rate or blood gases or other dimensions that can be diagnostic of their health conditions. And smartphones and other internet-linked devices will allow for this kind of monitoring of patients remotely and for emergency responses when needed. This kind of integrated, information-based, digitally built community outreach health system is not necessarily very expensive, but it is a kind of transformation that's just waiting to happen, especially in the low-income countries where real leapfrogging is possible, real jumping ahead in technology is possible. A third major dimension of health and well-being involves the social determinants of health. When society is ill, when there's conflict, when there is extreme inequalities of status and power, or when there is vulnerability to substance abuse, even companies pushing drugs that they know to be addictive, something terrible that has happened in the United States in the last 20 years with the opioid-based medicines, which led to a nationwide addiction and tens of thousands of deaths per year in the U.S. These social determinants of health are major factors in well-being, especially when unrestrained and irresponsible companies are pushing drugs or are in our food industry pushing unhealthy foods or inducing gambling and income losses or other kinds of addictions, mental illnesses, depression, loss of social support, lifestyle changes that cause ill health. All of these can result in terrible epidemic scale problems. In the United States, we have an epidemic of suicides. We have an epidemic of massive depressive disorders. We have an epidemic of substance abuse, including opioid use. We have the epidemic of obesity coming from our industrialized food systems with heavy sugar additives and processed grains in ways that are very, very unhealthy for the population. And these are causes of disease burden, depression, and mood disorders and loss of well-being. So if we're really aiming at health and well-being for all, we have to look at these social determinants beyond the formal health system. A fourth area that is critically important for health is, of course, environmental health. And the SDGs call for a safe physical environment. Millions of people are dying in polluted areas around the world, especially from particulate pollution, from PM 2.5, a heavy burden of particulate pollution which leads to lung disease, cardiovascular disease, cancers, and claims millions of lives per year. Water pollution, similarly, can be carcinogenic, and lead to other kinds of poisoning. Climate change itself is a huge risk factor. Think of it, heat waves have killed thousands and thousands of people. The numbers will rise inexorably because some parts of the world, say in central and southern India, are becoming so hot in the hot seasons that life becomes basically unbearable unless there's access to air conditioning, and that is out of reach of many poor households. In addition, climate change causes a worsening and a widening of the area of transmission of many tropical diseases, often so-called vector-borne diseases carried by mosquitoes. The range of malaria has increased, the range of dengue fever has increased, the range of Zika virus has increased. There are other emerging diseases that are probably climate-related. And climate change, of course, is leading to climate-related disasters, such as high-intensity hurricanes and typhoons, such as massive flooding, such as droughts which kill crops, lead to hunger, and therefore lead to death as well. Well, a health system cannot cope with this kind of change. That's why SDG 13, to stop human-induced climate change, is so crucial. But a health system and SDG 3 calling for a healthful society needs to be cognizant of the environmental threats and take the measures possible for resilience to protect populations against these threats. Taken together, this is the transformation to health and well-being, health systems, health outreach, addressing the social determinants of health, and addressing environmental determinants of health, all in a holistic manner. This is the direction for SDG 3 and the other health-related sustainable development goals. In this chapter, I'll talk about the third of the 6 transformations. That is the transformation to clean energy and ecologically sound industry that picks up after its own mess and keeps the environment safe, sometimes called the circular economy. This, of course, constitutes one of the great purposes and great challenges of the Sustainable Development Goals: how to make a rapid, decisive shift from a world economy dependent on fossil fuels to a world economy operating on clean, safe energy. What does clean, safe energy mean? Specifically, it means energy that does not release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that contributes to global warming and climate change more generally. And we have an urgent challenge here because the world economy has grown up as a fossil fuel-based economy. Over the roughly 200 years of the spread of fossil fuel use from the steam engine to the internal combustion engine and the gas turbines and all of the power plants running on coal around the world, we have a world economy where around 85% of primary energy comes from fossil fuels. And that means a massive amount of CO2 emissions, in fact, running roughly at 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere each year, mainly from energy and industrial processes. So this transformation is central to achieving SDG 13, central to achieving the Paris Climate Agreement, and part and parcel of SDG 7, which calls for access to modern energy services for all, but in a safe manner, not by simply replicating the fossil fuel economy, but building a renewable energy infrastructure for the world economy. So how can this transformation be done? Well, there are, as with the other transformations, several components, and I'll emphasize 4. First, we need a transformation to zero carbon electricity. Electricity will be the great energy carrier for the 21st century. It's, of course, how we power the digital world, but it will be the way we power our vehicles. Rather than using fossil fuels in the gas tank in an internal combustion engine, we're going to be driving electric vehicles. Rather than heating our homes through a furnace that's burning heating oil, we will use electricity-based heating methods such as heat pumps in order to keep our buildings warm in winter. So how do you get to zero carbon power generation, zero carbon electricity? Of course, the key way is to have zero carbon primary energy sources: wind, solar power, hydroelectric power, geothermal energy, biofuels, ocean power, or nuclear energy. So these are all primary energy sources that do not release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Of course, there are pluses and minuses for each of these, and some places say no to nuclear energy, though other places use nuclear energy and will continue to deploy nuclear energy. But among that set of options, countries will choose in significant part based on the resources that they have. Are they in a sunny climate, in a say a dryland or desert region which has massive amounts of sunshine? Are they in a windy environment where they can harness wind power? Are they in a mountain environment or near enough to one where hydroelectric power becomes an energy source of choice? Most of these low carbon energy sources, not nuclear, but the other ones, are characterized by some degree of intermittency. Wind when the wind blows, solar energy when the sun is shining, hydroelectric power often on a seasonal basis when the rivers are running. And so the questions of storage or balancing intermittency by connecting larger geographic areas through long-distance transmission grids so that when it's not windy in one place, it is windy in another, is part of the story of harnessing zero-carbon electricity. Storage itself is a big issue through batteries or through pumping water into mountain reservoirs that can then be used as a kind of battery by letting the water come back down through turbines producing hydroelectric power, so-called pumped hydro storage. But the first pillar is zero carbon electricity. The second pillar that I've mentioned already is electrification of energy users, that to move from fossil fuel use in the gas tank of a light-duty vehicle to a battery or to a fuel cell that uses hydrogen produced by renewable energy, for example. This can be done with technologies that we have, by and large, almost across the board. There are still some areas like aviation and heavy shipping, large ships, that can't run on batteries the same way that a light-duty vehicle can, but they can run on hydrogen-powered fuel cells or direct hydrogen combustion in the case of ocean vessels, or perhaps through synthetic liquid hydrocarbons that is not dug up from the ground, but is captured from the air and from the use of renewable energies, synthetic hydrocarbon. So this kind of electrification is the second major pillar. It would mean that most of the energy users can rely on electricity that itself is produced by zero carbon. Of course, the third dimension to reaching zero CO2 emissions is much greater energy efficiency. the less energy that we need, the easier it is to make the transition from fossil fuels to renewables, because we'll need less of the renewable energy. And there are huge gains that can be made in energy efficiency. Smart appliances, certainly. Smarter building construction with better insulation shells for buildings so that you don't need as much energy for the heating and cooling of the buildings. So this is the three-pillar approach to decarbonizing the energy system. Zero carbon electricity, electrification or synthetic fuels, and energy efficiency. To achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, that energy transformation needs to be combined with a process of reducing the pollutants from industrial processes as well. That's SDG 12, which calls for cleaning up after ourselves. It calls for sustainable production systems, and especially what's called the circular economy. When waste is coming out of an industrial process, try to use the waste as an input, or at least re-engineer the process, different kinds of chemistry, so that the waste that's coming out is not toxic, but is easily absorbed in the environment. Here, green chemistry will be absolutely crucial, changing the way that plastics are produced so that they can be recycled, changing the materials that we use so that the materials themselves automatically become biodegradable, or using recycling processes more generally so that our waste isn't simply collected and dumped in a landfill which becomes toxic or which itself emits the greenhouse gas methane into the atmosphere, but the waste is used for energy or directly for recycling or as an input to industrial production processes. This kind of closing the loop, or the so-called circular economy, together with the transformation from fossil fuel-based energy to zero emission energy systems, is key for achieving sustainable development, protecting the climate, and protecting us from pollution. In this chapter, I'll consider the fourth of the major transformations to sustainable development, and that is the transformation to sustainable food and land use. We don't think often enough or clearly enough about the massive impacts that producing food and other agricultural products has on the environment. But the fact of the matter is that agriculture is probably the most important human or anthropogenic driver of environmental degradation. Agriculture contributes to all aspects of our environmental crises. Agriculture is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. First, the energy input into agriculture emits carbon dioxide. Second, the use of fertilizer, the very heavy use of fertilizer, leads to nitrous oxide emissions into the atmosphere. Livestock, the ruminants, cows, for example, as well as rice paddies, lead to methane emissions and are major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, therefore, and global warming. So land use is a major contributor to climate change, but it's a major contributor to the other two great environmental crises, the loss of biodiversity and pollution. Biodiversity is lost when forests or other land areas are converted to farm or pasture land. And we have in the forest margins of all of the great tropical forests, the Amazon, the Congo Basin, the Indonesian archipelago rainforests, massive amounts of conversion underway by smallholder farmers making small farms, by large loggers for tropical hardwoods, for cattle growers, for massive cattle ranches, some of which are quickly abandoned, for tree crops such as palm oil, where old growth forests are chopped down and palm oil is planted in place of it, but with a major loss of biodiversity. So habitat destruction goes hand in hand with expanded farm area. And there are, of course, massive pollutants involved in agriculture. Biomass burning by itself adds particulate pollution to the atmosphere, or the pesticides that are used in agriculture, or the nitrogen and phosphorus-based fertilizers that aggregate, are carried by rivers and groundwater to estuaries on the coast, lead to eutrophication because of all of the nutrients that enter the estuaries, and then lead to dead zones. The food that is produced is not all that healthy for many people in the world, and indeed is a direct contributor, either the food or the way it's processed, I should emphasize, is a direct contributor to obesity, metabolic disorders, cardiovascular disease, and the food system also impinges on other critical ecosystem functions, for example, on the vast amount of water that is used for agriculture, often unsustainably, by pumping water from ground aquifers, pumping it faster than it can recharge. The final dimension of unsustainability is equally frightening, and that is because of the environmental changes that are underway, many of which are caused by this sector itself. Agriculture is under massive threat. Climate change means higher temperatures, often to the extent of huge reductions of crop productivity. Climate change is leading to more intense storms, which destroy crops. Climate change is leading to sea level rise and flooding, which destroy crops. And so agriculture is also not resilient to the various kinds of environmental changes that are occurring at human hands. What SDG 2 in particular calls for is sustainable food systems that can feed the whole planet. Also, SDG 6 calls on us to have sustainable fresh water use. And since agriculture accounts for around 70% of all fresh water use, agriculture is central to achieving SDG 6, sustainable management of fresh water. Agriculture is also obviously therefore vital for SDG 14, the sustainability of marine ecosystems, and SDG 15, the sustainability of terrestrial ecosystems. So what are the major dimensions of the transformation to sustainability? Well, the first is that our food systems, the agricultural systems, themselves should be based on sustainable processes. And this means, for example, using more productive varieties of crops so that land use doesn't have to expand into areas where it should not go, for instance, into standing forests. By getting higher yields where food is produced, one can avoid the need or the temptation even to chop down the forest to expand the land areas. It means reducing post-harvest losses, because in some low-income countries, 20, 25%, 30% of what's grown never makes it to the marketplace because of losses in the fields or losses in storage. And we want in our farm systems to take it into account not only avoiding release of CO2 by chopping down trees, but restoration of degraded lands and reforestation of forests that were previously cut down to capture CO2 from the atmosphere in the biomass of plants, of the vegetation, in a biological manner. So that's a first pillar, is sustainable food systems. A second pillar is drawing boundaries. You will not go here. And those boundaries are the protected areas where there is high biodiversity and species that are under threat. For example, almost all of the world's great ape species in Africa and in Southeast Asia are under threat because their natural habitat is being destroyed by farmers, by loggers, by those growing tree crops such as the palm oil in Sumatra or in Borneo. And the solution to this kind of problem is to protect regions from agricultural encroachment. The great biologist, Harvard University professor E.O. Wilson, has called for protecting half the earth from human activities, saying that we need to put aside half of Earth in order to be able to stop this rampant human-caused destruction of biodiversity. So finding, identifying, and then implementing protected regions is absolutely crucial. These are both terrestrial protected areas and increasingly ocean, marine protected areas as well for corals and fish and marine ecosystems generally. Another part of protecting the ecosystems, of course, is cutting the pollutants, and it is managing these resources by harvesting them in a sustainable manner, notably in fisheries, where overfishing leads to a collapse of fisheries, and we need to protect species by limiting the amount of fisheries, for instance, by using systems of tradable permits and quotas that are essential for sustainable fisheries. A third dimension of sustainable land use and sustainable agriculture is shifting our diets. Our diets are unhealthy in multiple ways and injurious to the environment also, in particular when we have heavy beef-eating dietary patterns. To grow a kilogram for eventual beef consumption typically requires 10 to 15 kilograms of feed grain. So reduced meat eating in general is one path to healthy diets and also more environmentally sustainable diets. A fourth dimension of achieving sustainable food and agriculture is the governance of supply chains. Let me show you a map. This is a map showing how food is traded globally. So you can see that China is an enormous importer. Those are the big blue lines connecting both North America, Canada, and the United States, with China as the ultimate market, and also the southern cone of South America, southern Brazil, and the Amazon basin also, Argentina, as major sources for China's feed grains, which are rising in import because China's eating more meat, and direct import, of course, of meat products and other agricultural products from South America. Now, this is a global supply chain. But what is the consequence? The consequence is that if you look at the upstream of that supply chain, especially in the Amazon basin, there's a massive loss of forest cover. Because to satisfy the growing demand of China for soybeans, the Amazon is being clear-cut to have more soybean farms. To satisfy the world demand for palm oil, which is used in many, many products, we're seeing a massive planting of palm oil plantations. So those are global supply chains. Now, who's responsible for the environmental degradation that is resulting from those supply chains? The answer right now in practice is nobody's responsible, and that's why there's so much degradation. But the answer in policy terms should be that the entire supply chain is responsible. The final dimension of sustainable food and agriculture is proper planning. Land use is complex because any parcel of land can be used for agriculture or cities or harvesting natural resources, or it can be used for ecosystem services and set aside as protection. Water can be used for ecosystem functions, or it can be abstracted for irrigation or hydroelectric power. We have multiple choices on the use of land. We don't think very clearly about those choices. Do we want this place to grow food? Do we want it to provide habitat for species? Do we want it to capture carbon to help protect the planet from human-induced climate change? Which will it be? And we need systematic land use planning that recognizes the multiple objectives from land: the food system, the water management, the biodiversity, the carbon storage, and then plans accordingly by drawing lines, by making limits, by giving incentives that certain places should be used for one purpose, other places for other, but we know what we're doing, because the Sustainable Development Goals in the end are about comprehensive objectives. We want to stop climate change. We want food for all that is healthful and reliable. We want to protect biodiversity. In order to do that, we need significant, serious upgrading of land use planning in all parts of the world. In this chapter, I'll consider the fifth of the great sustainable development transformations, and that is the transformation to smart cities and smart intercity transport. What do I mean, transformation to smart cities? Well, there are actually two kinds of transformations underway right now. The first is simply the transformation of most of the human population to cities. We are in the midst of the massive historical urbanization of human life. And we will have billions more people coming to cities in the coming decades. So making cities hospitable, productive, healthful, happy places to be is one fundamental challenge. But we also have to make a transformation, I would say, from dumb cities to smart cities. What do I mean by a dumb city? Well, in part, I mean a city that is based on unsustainable principles. And many cities in the 20th century, in the heyday of the automobile, viewed the goal of city life to be a long, sprawling city of low population density and a tremendous amount of automobile use. And in American cities built in the 20th century, it was typical that because of the low density sprawl and the exodus to the suburbs of American cities after World War II, that the automobile was king, and that people had to own an automobile or two automobiles in their households in order to be a part of this society. What do we know now? We know that this leads to massive congestion. It means actually often an unhealthy life, where instead of walking and bicycling and getting out in the fresh air, people are spending their time in automobiles. It means in commuting to and from work or to and from shopping malls. And it's pretty clear that most people don't want to live this way actually in the future, and that it's not environmentally sustainable. So that's one sense of moving from a dumb city to a smarter city that is designed to be more healthful, more pleasant, more clean, and less polluting. But there's another sense, of course, of the word smart, because in the digital age, we use smart to mean smart systems, smart machines that are cloud-based, internet-based, to help manage our economy and our daily lives. And smart cities is no different. Smart cities is the phrase that also conveys cities that are run on big data, cities that are run with efficiency in transport, in power use, in management of fresh water resources, in disaster preparedness and response, based on smart systems, remote sensing, real-time data, informatics, and so on. This is really the sense of this transformation to smart cities and smart intercity transport. How can we have urbanization for billions more people in a way that will be healthful, high quality of life, productive for the economy, and safe for the environment? And there are, as with all the other transformations, several dimensions of investment that are needed. The first is smart infrastructure in the smart sense of high positive impact on well-being and low impact on the natural environment. Well, one part of this will be essentially all electric cities. I live in New York City. Right now, New York City uses petroleum, of course, for our cars and trucks. It uses a lot of heating oil and natural gas for heating the buildings. It uses natural gas for power generation. And we have to move away from all of that use of fossil fuels to electric vehicles and public transport that does not depend on oil. And we need to produce power through zero carbon means. Cities need to prepare for this kind of all electric, zero emission future through building codes, through infrastructure points for charging automobiles, for the building design. Of course, cities also have to have a smart infrastructure for water and sewerage. Cities need to provide public transportation, which will be zero-emitting, electricity-based public transportation in general. And in laying out the roads and other land uses of a city, we now understand much better than 30 or 50 years ago how crucial it is for well-being, for the environment, for human health, to have plenty of walking spaces, green spaces, bicycle lanes. And the second dimension of this is indeed the zoning patterns. Rather than the sprawling automobile necessity cities of the 20th century, we will move increasingly towards high density walking cities of the 21st century. There are also, by many kinds of evidence, the more pleasant and interesting places to live. Urbanists talk about mixed use streets where people live together, close together in apartment flats, for example, but on streets with shops, interesting places to walk, and plentiful parks, and walking zones and bicycling zones. So this means that we need strategies of affordable housing in high-density, mixed-use settlements that aim to rely heavily on walking, bicycling, and public transportation as opposed to automobiles. A third part of smart cities is the information and communications network. It's clear that the power generation, the transport, the public safety, the policing, the management of the utilities, including water and sewerage, all will rely increasingly on cloud computing, real-time data, and automatic systems, artificial intelligence systems, that are managing in a highly sophisticated way energy efficiency, efficiency of transport routes, and so on. These kinds of smart cities require a broadband internet grid that is accessible. Many cities are providing basically an open access network for all, collecting a lot of data that then is made available to the business community for applications, to the research community, to households, and so forth for more effective living in the urban environment. This is smart in the information technology sense. We know also that this smart information will be an enabler of changing how we continue to use the light-duty vehicles that we use now as personally owned automobiles, because we're already moving to a share economy where instead of owning an automobile, we'll use an automobile as a service when we need it. And we'll have on our apps, as is true in cities all over the world, the ability to locate a share vehicle or to call it. It may be an autonomous vehicle soon enough where there's no driver, but it just shows up on location. You take your ride, you're automatically charged. But we won't own those vehicles. They will be part of a commercial fleet that is able to use the smart grid. A fourth dimension of sustainable cities, SDG 11, is the resilience of our cities to environmental hazards. I think of the 2017 hurricane season in the United States, when nearly back-to-back over a period of a few weeks we had 3 mega hurricanes. Hurricane Harvey, which slammed into Texas, into Houston, causing massive damage. We had Hurricane Irma, which hit the Caribbean and Florida. We had Hurricane Maria, which devastated Puerto Rico. And in all cases, cities were inundated with massive flooding, something I recall from the superstorm that New York City had in 2012, Superstorm Sandy, which was another massive hurricane which came up the east coast of the United States and slammed into New Jersey and New York and caused tens of billions of dollars of losses. Well, smart cities will be resilient cities that are preventing disasters through breakwaters and other flood control measures, that have sustainable water use so that they are not vulnerable to droughts, that have disaster response so that when a climate shock such as an intensive heat wave hits, there's an effective response to that. And increasingly, as climate change raises the sea level, which is going to happen in the 21st century, we don't know whether it's centimeters or many meters, we're going to have to be resilient against overall sea level rise. And that's another major dimension of urban sustainability, since so many of the world's largest cities are concentrated on the coast, where people want to live and where it's easiest to engage in ocean-based trade, but where there's the highest vulnerability to rising sea levels resulting from anthropogenic climate change. Finally, we need smart intercity transport and smart intercity infrastructure. And this means also shifting from fossil fuel-based transport between cities to fast rail that is electric and running on our zero carbon power grid. We need fiber running between the cities. We need effective and shared water management. Our intercity infrastructure needs to be smartened up and made more resilient. So this fifth transformation is absolutely critical, especially for SDG 11, which calls for sustainable human settlements, especially sustainable cities, and SDG 9, which points us towards sustainable infrastructure generally. In this chapter, I'll discuss the sixth and the final, but by no means the least of the great sustainable development transformations that we will need to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement, and that is the transformation to digital societies. As all of us feel, we're in the midst of one of the most remarkable technological revolutions of human history. In fact, I think it's a technological revolution that rivals the steam age, which brought the beginnings of modern economic growth with the invention of the steam engine. That was followed by the age of electrification and the internal combustion engine, the next phase of the world economy, roughly from the 1860s and 70s through the early part of the 20th century, to the age of mass communications, radio and television, ultimately the internet, of course, the gas turbine and aviation, all of which was a next wave of massive technological advance, and which included the inventions of new forms of production processes like Henry Ford's assembly line. Well, for at least 3/4 of a century, actually, we have been in the midst of yet another mega technological change that can be called overall the digital revolution. It dates back to the 1930s, in fact, when one of the greatest geniuses of humanity and of the 20th century, Alan Turing, gave the concept of universal computing machine and the idea of what computers reading zeros and ones could actually accomplish. There were other great geniuses of breakthroughs. The microprocessor that Intel brought us to make for powerful computation and our laptops, and eventually these microprocessors were so cheap, so powerful that they began to be inserted everywhere, of course, in our phones, but in our automobiles, in our machinery, in our appliances, in our homes, and on and on. Then came the internet, the ability to interconnect these increasingly smart machines with these increasingly smart microprocessors, and that has given us the internet age, broadband, smartphones, cloud computing, and now the ubiquity of digital capacity. Finally, I would mention a set of inventions and discoveries that also date back at least half a century, but that have become mind-boggling in their acceleration and success in recent years, and that's artificial intelligence. The capacity to train smart systems to do amazing superhuman feats. Computers, of course, that easily and routinely defeat the greatest international chess grandmasters, the world's Go champions, but now also compete with and supersede diagnosticians and radiologists who read X-rays or other imaging, smart systems that can identify faces in large crowds, that can replicate speech patterns and can do an ever-exploding range of human tasks that are transforming every sector of the economy. This is the digital age. The digital age is profoundly important as perhaps the most important set of new tools to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Every other tool that I've talked about, including renewable energy, smart grid, smart transport, live on the digital revolution, are made possible by it, are made powerful by it. And therefore, no society in the 21st century is going to achieve sustainable development without building on an ICT, information and communications technology platform. Of course, the same digital revolution which is giving us all of these marvelously powerful tools is also creating massive perplexity, dangers, headaches, potential disasters. This is humanity. We invent a new technology, it can be used for the good, it can be used for evil. For all the positives, we have all the new threats of loss of privacy, loss of rights, vulnerability to new kinds of warfare. And so the sixth of the great transformations of the digital revolution is both a transformation of technology and a transformation of governance so that the technology is properly used safely. This is a huge challenge. There's no guarantee whatsoever of success. What are the elements of this sixth transformation? Well, it starts with universal access to the internet, to broadband, the ability to tap into worldwide information, to stream information, to convey information, to make computations increasingly in the cloud, to be able to use applications that depend on the nearly instantaneous transmission of vast terabytes of data. It means that all government facilities, clinics, schools, government information centers need to be online, accessible, linked into households for health purposes or for e-governance, for enabling households to take advantage of public services and enabling governments to carry out those public services efficiently. It means the development of new forms of online service delivery. But the smart systems need to be designed, localized, put into the local context. There can be great advances in education. Places where there are no teachers can have classrooms and the teacher can be hundreds of miles away. Places where there's a local language which is not the national language can use real-time smart translation systems that are increasingly proficient to be able to provide curriculum in local language. A second huge advance will come through universal identity. In India, the government has been implementing in recent years a system called Aadhaar, which gives a unique biometric eye scan or iris scan online identity, which the individual can use for opening bank accounts, for e-commerce, for transferring funds. These online services will depend on safe, reliable, private online identity. One of those services is a third dimension of the digital transformation, and that is online payments and online financial inclusion, banking, borrowing funds online. This is already providing Africa with a remarkable leapfrogging of financial services. People now have access to banking services that have never stepped foot in a bank. People, large parts of a population that had no bank accounts, no financial services at all, now have them on their phone and may never see in their lifetimes, in fact, a bank branch, or won't even need an ATM machine to get physical cash, because payments will be electronic and the ability to transfer money will be almost free, essentially very low cost, and other banking services will be available. So the whole financial industry will be upended, but I think if this is properly governed in a very efficient and effective and inclusive manner. And this brings me to the fourth dimension of the digital transformation, and that is the governance part of this transformation. What are the new rules of the game of our digital age? Well, there's some obviously positive sides, but then there's some very, very big question marks. The positive side is that much or most of what government does today can be done online, at least the interface between government and the individual. Getting a license, a driver's license, a birth certificate, a voting registration can now be done almost instantly and without hassle and reliably, and with the records kept through online government provision of services. It should be possible to maintain up-to-date, effective, real-time voter registration and even voting online. Estonia is an example of a country that is pioneering e-voting. The questions of security, safety, protection from hacking, and all the rest are very real. But the ability to engage the whole citizenry in a much more intensive way, I think, is an enormous potential. But the other side of this is the risks. Where will be the privacy? Where will be the freedom from government surveillance that could be used for rounding up political opponents? Governments will have the capacity, technically, to tap into every one of our messages and contacts and locations, and this could pose a profound threat. And of course, so too could, and I will say, alas, will, the militarization of this technology as well, because we are on the brink, maybe we've already crossed it, in fact, of cyber warfare, of autonomous systems, of warfare getting out of control of humanity. It's never in control, almost by definition, but it could become even more dangerous in the future. Well, both the pluses and the minuses constitute a transformation in the sense that we need to promote the pluses and govern downsides of the potential negatives. And that's why I would put this digital transformation as one of the greatest themes of sustainable development.